IVM. IVM.
This is Audio Gyan, and I am your host Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. Prati means edition in Kannada. Atelier Prati, based in Bangalore, along with tracing print histories and looking at infrastructural innovations in manufacturing, printmaking equipments, hosts residencies, conduct workshops, curates, and initiates cross-disciplinary collaborations to propose new approaches to ideas in print and off print. To discuss this and more, today we have Jayasimha Chandrashekhar with us on AudioGan. He founded Atelier Prati in Bangalore. Jay has been envisioning a space for printmaking in Bangalore since he graduated from College of Fine Arts in 2017. Welcome, Jay, to AudioGan. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you, Kedar. Likewise.
Superb. So as I mentioned, I have these three formats: AudioGan, regular interviews, case study, and biographies. In case study, we generally try and deep dive into one problem area, one solution, one project, one project, and just going deeper into it. So I wanted to pick your brains around what is Atelier Prati, how did you form it, and some bits of printmaking, some history, generally all about print, right? So yeah, that's what the premise is. And I wanted to start off by asking, what is Atelier Prati and why did you form it?
Well, yeah, I think probably even before most of us know what is Atelier mean and what is Prati. Of course, I'll have to explain in some time because it's rooted in Kannada and I'll have to give some explanations to it. But the whole idea sparked off or started, as when I enrolled for an undergraduate program in printmaking from a very old institute, in fact, Kalamandir School of Arts in Bangalore. It's actually established in 1990 and it recently celebrated 100 years. And, unlike other colleges, Pioneer, there is one which is like the oldest. I was fortunate enough to be part of that, institute and to study and learn printmaking in my undergrad program there. But there's a little bit of back history. I don't know if I can dig into if we have time. But yeah,
Sure.
So after my +2, which I terribly failed, there was a bomber there. And so I had no other option. And back in the days, I think animation was like the big thing. And that was sort of like a logical or a rationale to get into in life because I was inclined into drawing and design and things like that. So somehow I convinced my parents to enroll me for an animation program. When I got in there, I met a facilitator, Mr. Baswacha, who is the mentor, who sort of opened up a lot of avenues to me. He's the one who really, put me into this whole idea or allowing me to understand there is this specialization or a practice called printmaking. Right. So when I joined there, side by side, he said, I think you might not fit here very well in animation. I think you should try, having a undergrad degree in fine arts. And so that's when it started. And I went myself and enrolled for this program in Kalamandir School of Arts, where my specialization was in printmaking. And this is where it started, my interest towards printmaking.
Okay. And if you can give some bits of like what is Prati in Kannada. I started, it means edition, but if you can just give some backstory of the name itself, how did it like emerge?
Yeah, I think what's very interesting in the title of our space is there's two things happening. One is like the Atelier, which of course is the word referred to all the studios in France. And there was a whole, if you look at the art history, there's a whole plethora of studios and, the overall Atelier 21, Atelier, there are many studios. Basically, it's studio. And Prati in Kannada, it has multiple meanings or associations. So Prati is a copy, Prati is a reflection, and Prati, it's also like every time, a repetitive act. So, it sort of like really made sense for us to use that word, and it was, yeah, logical, and nothing could go more logical than that. Like, so,
Beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, when you say repetition, I think I have like to circle back on this when it comes to printmaking. But yeah, so if we can start off with like giving some little bit of history of printing in India. I mean, we being always sort of very heavy on the oral tradition. I believe the paper came in China in some third century, right?
Hmm.
It almost took 10, 12 years to come to India, right? And obviously, there are different theories and different narratives, but maybe we could understand your version of how did it come to India, like a little bit of history of printing in India.
Well, I think, I mean, it's a very nicely framed question, but I would also like to add that, when it comes to printing, right, or the history of printing, it is inevitable to look at the history of literacy systems, right? And it's a highly contested space.
Yeah.
So I'm not a authority, like, to talk about it in that sense, but I have my own version, as you rightly put. Puzzling or picking up these larger ideas, and somehow bringing them together and making your own piece of information.
Yeah.
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 But I think, alongside oral histories, there was a very strong lineage of recording things in India, right? There's a popular idea that, we as a country, as a culture, I mean, of course, oral traditions were the, thing of ours, but there were also like things like inscriptions, right?
Mm.
And there were like, manuscripts, like palm leaf manuscripts, and in fact, I think, the earliest form of printmaking can be traced back into India, if I'm not wrong, because block printing has always been there, right? And it suddenly finds in this whole timeline, it gets categorized where paper becomes the quintessential material, which of course was originated in China.
Mm.
And there's a long bit of history to it, and I think we might even not make a justice in a session, like in a dialogue like this. But of
Mm.
course, the first ever printed matter in terms of on a paper is being dated to China. In fact, more than anything, it was a currency, right? It goes
Mm.
back to Song dynasty, where they made an attempt to make a currency out of a paper, right? And I mean, they're sitting with this invaluable, or like, I don't know how to even put it in a
Word it. Yeah.
this material, and they come up with an idea of printing on it, and making a common thing such as like a currency, right? It's a radical idea, I think. So, well, of course, that's there, but there is another contested history that paper was made in Egypt, right? And but it's actually not paper, it's papyrus. So papyrus is sort of like a woven material, and paper is a non-woven material,
Mm.
so in Egypt there are inscriptions or materials which are made out of papyrus, where you take a bark of a plant papyrus and you strip them into pieces. There's a chatai, they make that mat, no? So it's basically, they made those mats, and they started, there was a series of people who are inscribing on it, and there are these documents which goes back to Egypt.
Mm.
But in China, it's interesting because along with inventing this material as paper, because it was bound to happen, they pioneered with silk, and they were already like working with silk and with mulberry. Especially mulberry was like the space for growing silkworms, right?
Mm. Mm.
And there are many stories, anecdotes, fantastic anecdotes around it. Like one day a queen was sitting and sipping a tea, and then suddenly a silkworm fell into her tea, and then she realized, if a worm is put in a hot water, you can bring out the entire spool of silk from the worm, right? I mean, there are stories like that, which is interconnected there. So again, going back to my train of thought, yes, it started in China, and it came to India very slowly as a material. But there were inscriptions in stone, and there were also attempts by Buddhist monks who were always on the run, right, to sort of capture these, or make an impression out of it,
Mm.
using these leaves and whatnot, whatever the materials were involved back in the days. So
Okay.
that's the part with Asia, right?
Correct.
And then yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but in fact, there's one more narrative which I'd heard was that, and I couldn't spot the roots of it, but the Tamil script, some of the South Indian scripts are also in a particular direction and a particular styling just because they used to write on leaves. So the veins of the leaf used to dictate or demand a particular way it's supposed to be written so that it doesn't tear the leaf also. So I'm sure that writing would be like much more deeper as we may not perceive it. You know what I mean, right? It to be like much more deeper than that.
Well, I mean, actually, any form of printing is dependent on the material, right?
Correct.
Like even if you go back to, if you look at the Mokohanga tradition of woodcuts, or if you go back to Japan, if you go back to China, it's all guided by the material, right? So, but this narrative of Tamil scriptures being, written in a certain way, I think there are spin-offs in making a narrative, right? And back in the days, it was a series of people who were sitting and as scribes, sitting and writing things on, material, and each one has their own signature by virtue of them. Like today, we celebrate handwritings. So yeah, I mean that was there, but it took a significant role later in the history. I think we should also probably look at the European history of printing and what happened there, and how it came back to India, and also end of the day, printing is also a way of colonizing. So there are many things involved in that.
Got it. Got it. In fact, there's one more interesting piece which I heard recently is many times when the British used to have a conversation, since it was oral, they couldn't really find a base, right? In today's day, the way we say that Google kar mil jayega, right? वैसे they used to say लिखा कहाँ है बताओ, like where is it written, right?
Yeah.
And that's why we were also compelled to write to just to prove that yes, it has got. I mean, if it's in Wikipedia, it could be true. That's sort of the 90s or 2000s narrative, right?
Yeah.
I think back then, if say I don't know, Vedas were just recited or some piece was just said, a lot of colonization didn't really hold it true. Like they would ask, where is it written? Show us. And that's how like more documentation also started. Is that correct understanding?
I mean, yeah. I mean, as I said, this is an uncharted boundary, like But in fact, if I can put a thought there, I think the earliest registered books pertaining to grammar, right? It goes back to India. There was an attempt to make grammar books for Sanskrit or Tamil, and so for a culture which believed so strong in oral tradition, and picking up these things and making into a book format itself is a radical thing. Quickly adapt and to move and to make certain things.
Yeah. The reason why I thought of this is because recently I was in a workshop where this guy, the speaker said Bhatkhande, the legendary musician, and actually like a teacher, like everything. He went on documenting all the things and then wrote a book because Hindustani classical music or Carnatic is very much improvisation. So they are just tripping on something, and he got offended. I mean, that's one of the story. So he said it's not tripping. It has got a framework. It has got a grammar. It has got everything. It is just that the framework is so agile that you can still explore and come back to the main rag. So yeah, I mean, that's where I thought it would be interesting.
Yeah. No, I mean, another interesting thing is if we look at the lineage of materials which are involved in printmaking. I'm sorry, I mean, throughout the conversation, I stress a lot about material, and that's the root of my practice, right? I mean, as I said, it started with stone, and then it slowly morphs into a palm leaf, and then there is a sophisticated structure as a cloth, and then there is an even more sophisticated structure as a paper. Right. So I think printmaking historically it's actually an evolutionary program which has gone in tandem with civilizations. As we discovered materials, as we, started inventing things, but the basic idea still remains the same. In I think 1600 or 1800 years of history, it just remains the same. The idea is to disseminate knowledge, and there's nothing radical which has come into or kicked in. In fact, for example, there's this particular technique called letterpress printing, when it was invented by a German, Johann Gutenberg. Not invented, he perfected the technique, right? Movable types were already there in China, right? But this fellow sort of rationalized the technique or rationalized the labor, took it back to Europe. And that particular printing technique could never find a parallel for 900 years.
Wow.
And we all our knowledge systems are printed in that, at like up until 1940s, if I'm not wrong.
Yeah, if you zoom out that way, is it not saying too much when we say that the inkjet and these sort of dot matrix printers had a really short life now because we are in this digital world,
Yeah.
and then like 800 900 years of like pure material pink,
Yeah.
whatever, like print and ink and oil.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's
I
interesting.
have an interesting story to that. You know what?
Please, yeah.
If you look at the digital or the inkjet printing, right, any form of digital printing, and if you look at any form of conventional printing, the quintessential principle is the same. It's a binary system. There is a dot of ink or there is no ink. If you look at into computer, it's 1 or 0. Between these extremes, these are the illusions we create, we work with. Like if you look at like an 8-bit system or a 32-bit system or a 16-bit system, it's a multiple of what the binaries, what we are working with, right? Either there is light or there is no light. And in print, either there is ink or there is no ink. And that's the same. We
Beautiful.
have such fancy machines which can sort of like perform in microns. And I mean, here's another thing. I think as much as Asia has contributed to print, I think the Germans have done in the same way, right? And all the breakthrough inventions in printing technologies are made by Germans. I mean, it's very interesting to look at. If you look at lithography, it's a German, a stage playwright who someday accidentally invented this technique. If you look at letterpress, it's Johann Gutenberg who sort of perfected the technique. So I think Germans have contributed a lot in terms of printing technologies. But, let me not stop myself there. What I was trying to attempt was like, if you look at the best machines in the world, like the Heidelberg offset machines, right? They perform in such speed that we can't even comprehend in our real life. But they still operate on the same logic. There is ink, there's no ink. There's nothing beyond that.
Beautiful. Yeah, it gives a very interesting perspective to look at things. Yeah. I mean, you know it, but it just like, it gives like a pause to think about it. Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let's take a short break. Yeah. We'll be right back.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Revlon filing for bankruptcy and Sony Liv's success story. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus was not there with us this week because he's vacationing in Spain. Ayushi, Sriram, Antriksh and Abbas, however, discuss airline etiquette and gifts they're given to their exes. On The Wire Talks, author Aparna Piramal Raje tells Siddharth how she coped with bipolar disorder. On Press Decode, Sarah Vagda and Prafula take a look at the porn industry. And on Big Talks About Tiny Humans, Devi Shobha and Meghna discuss 4 major parenting styles. Just a reminder to everybody, the IVM merchandise is now available. You can go to the IVM Podcast website and click on the shop tab. Check out our first collection of t-shirts. Also, do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And I'd like to remind you all that it is really, really helpful for us when you do recommend this show or any of our other shows to a friend. Word of mouth is great for us, and it's really a great way for us to grow our audience and have more people for you to discuss your podcast consumptions with. Also, don't forget to rate us on any platform you're listening on, and you can also check us out on YouTube at ivmpodcast.com/YouTube. We have a list of the YouTube channels we are on. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Capgemini, Intel vPro, and Intel Future But Now Wonderful. Thank you so much for making this possible.
Okay, welcome back to the show. Yeah, we'll circle back on lithography.
We'll eventually come back, I guess. Yeah, I think when you ask that question, probably I think I should also probably slightly assert there's a difference between printing and printmaking, and both of it has contributed in its own way. right? So often what happens is we tend to get lost in or get interchanged in these terminologies, what is printing and what is printmaking, right? From the day one, it's just been printing. But printmaking is a terminology which was picked up later, right? For example,
So yeah, I mean that was my one of the questions. Like, what is printmaking for a layman, and what are the nuances or like the subtle or evident differences between, say, printmaking and printing?
Yeah. So, okay, I think again we have to go back to the history of printing. It could be East or the West, Again, it's a contested space. But the core idea of anything to do with printing is the dissemination of knowledge, right? Back in the days, the availability of the material and the availability of skilled people, who can deal with a certain material in a certain way was the prerequisite for any sort of, knowledge dissemination, right? Like if we look at it, the first Bible which was printed or the first compilation of Shakespeare's work which was printed, they are in numbers like 200 or 300, and that number, today it's a joke. But back in the day, it was 200 people who could have this repository of knowledge, right? So what happened down the lane was when the techniques got sophisticated, there were a lot of people who are involved in it. Like, for example, to a very longest period of time, there was no idea of an artist printmaker. It was always printmaker. It was a designation. It was a serious craft, right? And there were like other, specializations like the stone men who used to like, what do you call, bring in all the letters in letterpress printing, the types, and sort of put them on a stone which is perfectly flat and make sure they're all level. They were called stone men. So there were these hierarchies in labor, right? So it was an industry, and it is still an industry. In fact, India is the biggest printing economy in the world, right? And what I'm saying is it becomes printmaking when artists embrace the technique and when they started creating their own works, right? So, for example, let me just quickly give you an, whatever, a painted image on this. If there was a Mokohanga artist back in the days, he used to paint the design, yeah, on a piece of paper, and that was given it to the key block maker. That was a serious craft. It was a trade. That guy only used to sit and carve. The artist would never sit and carve, right? So he used to carve, and later, after this person who has carved all these multiple blocks for whatever multiple colors, whatnot, and all of that, it used to go to a printer. So there is a hierarchy within the system, right? I think this hierarchy largely was broken at the time of German Expressionism. I mean, this is like a historical or a time frame in art history, what people usually look at. But it was right after World War One, and there was this trauma, and there was so much things to say, where artists picked up these techniques and they started doing it on their own. They no longer wanted to depend on these, crafts people.
Wow.
Right. And then it's like a liberation. Like, you can do whatever you want to do and you can put it out in the real world. So I think, according to me, printmaking as a term became fortified in that time, in that history, in that timeline of the history. And later, a lot of artists picked it up and, they started experimenting with it. They started doing things with it. Innovations kicked in. Artists have also contributed significantly as other people or from other walks of life. For example, if you look at Mr. Krishna Reddy, who is been acclaimed for inventing this particular technique called viscosity, he sort of partnered with a French printmaker, William Hayters, and they both extensively researched and gave us to this real world this technique called viscosity printing, right? So I think it's always like, and I mean, sometimes it's very poetic. Like earlier there was no copper, it was wood, people were making woodcuts. Later in the day, copper as a material was invented, people started making dry points. And then they borrowed a little bit of, what do you call them? Alchemists, their techniques, and they got to know how to etch a copper with acid. So they could achieve finer details in their prints, right? And then that's how it's a progress. And, I think it's very difficult to sort of look at it in a very linear perspective as a historical time. I think it's a web.
Yeah, I can Yeah, in fact, when you said about how, like, due to so much sharing, or the drive to share so much, they skipped and maybe started doing on their own, and that's where till date we are suffering and not having good craftsmen.
True, true, true. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm just curious, Kedar, like, what is your idea of print? Like, how do you see print material every day, or like, what's your opinion about print?
Yeah, I don't know, yeah. Like, frankly, I'm going to come and visit your studio. What my exposure to print making has been very close. I've been following Anthony Burrell
Uh-huh.
for quite some time. I happened to meet him at Design Yatra as well.
Hmm.
So I had a chat with him. There's a episode which I did with him. So my exposure has been just limited to Anthony Burrell. I had recently gone to Jaipur, where I found few blocks of good type design,
Yeah,
as in like good
yeah,
letters which are carved on a wood,
yeah.
and I did a bit of lino cut printing, but that's pretty much it. And I am working on a project which I'll definitely talk about after this recording. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's fascinating. Like, it's wonderful to know so many layers to it.
I mean, see, I mean, it's also after a point, it's very difficult to escape from it because all sorts of information, for example, like before this whole internet boom, right? I think, I don't know if you remember, there's a particular publication, it's called the Collier's Encyclopedia,
Hmm.
right? They used to come up in like 21 volumes, right? And it's like the Google or whatever, like the internet search base, right? Anything you want to know, people used to go to that encyclopedia. It's all summed up, and there are indexes, there are bibliographies attached to it. Everything is in print, right?
Yeah.
And it's also very interesting that how often we think about a lot of other paraphernalia which is around us, like magazines, film posters, matchboxes. It can be as simple as like a pataka, like a firecracker, and an artwork printed on top of it, so
Yes.
it's everywhere, predominantly everywhere, and we cannot escape from it for sure.
Correct, correct. In fact, like, if you think of in that axis, there has been some records which are maybe like 10, 12, 14 generations older, which are still written in hand by these people in Varanasi and
Yeah. Scribed.
parts of, yeah, like,
Yeah.
matlab, who's your father, and then fathers, mothers, fathers, and like just go on till like some 10, 15 generations, because everyone used to come for the death rituals there. So they used to just put, and there are like huge go downs with just like print stuff, right? It's not printed, but it's handwritten, but still on paper. So it's somewhere has a record.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think on that lens, let me tell you, like, one. So there's a set of, like, it's a suite of 142 aquatints, which was commissioned, I think, by the Queen. These are British artists, Thomas and William Daniels, right? And that particular suite is the earliest record of India, which has been published. These cousins who visited India, they've produced these 142 individual works, which are again editioned into whatever numbers, right? Up until 1800s, when the photography as a technique was invented, that was the only painted picture of India. So, that's how India was perceived in the West. So I think print has its own fair share, like in terms of establishing certain ideas or painting a landscape to someone, far in the ocean and things like that.
Yeah, yeah. I did an episode with on map, how a boundary is designed and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's fascinating because that's also a form of like putting a spatial sort of design on a paper,
Yeah.
and that becomes pretty much a reference point for everyone, how it is, how the country looks, or how the geography is shaped, and where is the ocean. So yeah, it's just like endless. Print hai to sab kuch hai types.
No, it's definitely endless. In fact, actually, if you this particular example, what I gave you about Thomas and William Daniel, they are not just mere painted pictures anymore. If you retrospect on them, if you relook at them, they become a site of study for, like, recording history, ethnographic studies. What is a painting? What is a visual language? There are these documents which carry these sort of substantial information, like, one can endlessly sit and mull about. right? I mean, unlike a newspaper, what we get today in a Belpuri shop, it's like it's just been rolled up, and it's always contested in that sense.
Cool. I think I've like a couple of more questions. So if you can quickly touch upon what are the different types of printing, or printing, I would keep it very focused. Say like lithography, or like any different varieties, or are they categorized in a particular order, or is it just like a flat
So
list of
yeah,
10 techniques?
no, I mean, see, each individual who practices printmaking, it's a technique in his own right, his or her own right? But largely, print has these grand pigeonholes or brackets or whatever we would like to call them. In terms of techniques, again, it's a very material intensive or oriented thing, right? So it starts with relief printing. Relief printing is a bracket where it's like lino cut, wood cut, block printing, whatever.
A reverse image.
Reverse is the constant in every other printing technique, unless it's an offset printing where it's been deliberately, I'll explain that in some
Yeah.
time. But so relief printing is basically, as the title suggests, it's like you're making an impression from a relief, from a high surface. So that's one category. Relief printing is where you sort of knock out or take away the negative areas, the unwanted areas. You don't want these things to be printed. Right? If you just take a piece of wooden slab and you roll up some ink to it and you put it into pressure, you will get just a black patch.
Yeah.
Now, in that, if you want to sort of create a design, it's basically actually a design, right? So if you want to create a design, you knock out where the ink should not hit the surface of the paper. You carve out physically. So that's relief printing. Later, as we got our hands into newer materials and copper as a material was found, and all of that, there is a mega umbrella. It's called intaglio with a G. Intaglio is a technique where it works a little. It's like opposite to relief printing, where what you do is you force the ink into the negative areas, or what you do is you carve your design into a block and you put your ink into it, and you make sure there is no ink on the surface. And you run it through an etching press. It's a machine exerting a lot of pressure. So, and then there is a paper which is dampened, and the paper which is dampened, which is soft in its state, it will go all the way into the pits or the crevices what you have carved in, and it will pick up that information from there, and then you get a impression out of it. So what falls in intaglio, like you have dry points, you have etchings, you have engravings, embossing. Most of these, they fall into intaglio, technique. So after intaglio, again, the next one logically coming is you neither cut nor you carve in. You barely do anything to a surface, which is lithography. Lithography is a name suggested. Litho means stone, and graph is like you're making a graph from a stone, right? Lithography. So basically, it started with a particular stone, which is limestone, and it still remains with that, which has a lot of pores in it, right? Lithography is also broadly called as plenography. Yeah. Third major umbrella, as I was suggesting, as I was sharing, it's plenography, and under plenography, it's lithography, and it's basically a technique where you neither carve or nor dig to produce an image. What you do is you basically employ a basic science, which is water and oil repel, right? And limestone is the stone usually which was used, when it was invented. And limestone, in its nature, has a lot of pores, and you take a piece of wax or a greasy material and you draw on the piece of stone, and the rest of the area you treat it with water, right? And when you charge ink on the stone, whatever area you have drawn with a waxy material, ink they get attracted, and the ink will go and get attached to the image which has been drawn on the stone, and the negative areas are kept safe or white because there's water repels the ink. So that's the basic technique. And of course, today it's gone to an extent where it's so sophisticated that we can't even comprehend the speed of it. All our offset printing. The term offset, it's actually again an accident. a German American, while printing a lithograph, misplaced a paper, and he printed back onto a blanket. Like there's a material, a rubber, blanket on the press, right? So it got printed on the blanket, and then he placed a paper and pulled a print from the blanket. So essentially, it was offset. The ink was offset. It went to rubber from stone, and then it came back to paper. Vis-a-vis, lithographs or any other printing techniques are printed directly from the matrix. Right? If there is a wooden block, you put a paper and you pull a print from the matrix. You don't transfer it to some other material and you bring it back again to paper. Yeah.
Oh, so beautiful.
So that was an accident, and then he realized when in that accident that prints made in this way are much more crisper, and he could control the amount of ink. So that's how offset printing started. But an interesting piece to this is it was still limited into black and white, or if you needed color, it was always under the
2 color or 3 color.
Yeah, it was always an artist who had to come and work around, or a serious craftsman who had to work on this. Later in the early 1800s, when the photography was also invented, there was a dire need to reproduce photographs, right? How do you reproduce a photograph? Because what we understand today as a photograph is not a photograph. What I mean by that is, if we look at in our computer, whatever we have shot from our phones, they're images. They're not photographs. Okay, let me explain. A photograph was something where you make a graph of light, right? You print. So like if you look at our earliest forms of photography printing techniques, like developing a negative, and then there was this thing called contact printing, enlarger printing. So it's all coming from a physical material, right? And there was a limitation to that. Now, people wanted to sort of reproduce these images and put it into like newspaper or any other paraphernalia, right? So there comes a serious English inventor, William Fox Talbot, who sort of came up with this idea of splitting an image into tiny bits of dots. At the start of this conversation, I was telling you there is a dot of ink and there is no ink. So that's called half-tone printing. Right? That's when you could break an image into series of dots, and then you can control those dots through etching a plate, and then you can print a photograph from that. A photograph is different from a print of a photograph. That's what I was trying to tell. Right? So,
but then what happens when you're developing that negative? What is happening there?
See, when you develop a negative, so what you do is you capture an image in a negative, right? And you go back to your darkroom and you process that negative. And once the processing of the negative is done, what you do is you get into a series of techniques, which is like either printing it from contact, where you keep that negative on your photosensitive paper and you make an image from it, right? Or you enlarge it through an enlarger and make it, right? You can make hundreds of prints of that with that technique, okay? But you cannot integrate that into a photomechanical process like a printing, like newspaper. How will you do that? You can't do that. Because in a dark room, if you want a print, you need a highly sensitive paper, which is very expensive. Right? You cannot make a newspaper out of a highly photosensitive paper. Right? So there was a gap to bridge. You had to bring that image into a popular or a mainstream or a commercially viable, space. So that's when half-tone printing came in. And later, that was appropriated for a particular field of study. I mean, color it's an ocean its own right. Today, we've, a lot of people, when we say offset, they say, humko pata hai, CMYK. What is CMYK? Basically, CMYK is these series of half-tones, which are split it into 4 parts. The cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. Right? And all these 4 colors come together. They don't mix. They just come together. They sit next to each other to create an illusion of a full spectrum of a photograph for us. If, for example, right after this conversation, if you have a magnifier and you go back and look at a newspaper image, you will be shocked. It's not a photograph. It's a series of dots, nothing else.
Yeah.
Our visual sense is not so sharp. We assume a lot of things in perception.
Wow, fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an endless exploratory journey. But yeah,
True.
cool. I think
And the last one, the last one in
yeah.
the umbrella is screen printing or serigraphy.
Oh, I thought screen printing was part of that etching process.
No, it's a different technique in its own right. Although it's the first ever printing technique, even before woodcut. But
Mm-hmm.
these are the four broad categories of printing.
Yeah. So if you want to just like tell about screen printing, because I wish to do
I
that
mean,
very soon.
basically, screen printing was never screen printing. It was serigraphy. It's basically you use a piece of silk cloth, stretch it to a wooden frame, and you cover the parts in the cloth where you don't want ink. And wherever you want, you let the cloth be as is, and you force the ink through that. It's basically a stencil printing technique. Right?
Hmm.
And later in the day, in 1930s, when nylon as a material was invented, silk screen was replaced by nylon, and hence it became screen printing, and the term serigraphy was taken away from it.
Hmm.
So
Is
yeah,
why is it then? Why is it sort of? I don't know. It's a personal inclination, but it feels much more warmer. You have a more tactile feeling to it as opposed to others, or am I not exposed to
no,
the
no, no.
others?
All printmaking techniques are tactile, and I mean, etching is complicated if you compare to silk screen, or if you or lithography is much more complicated to any of these techniques. So it
Hmm.
depends on what is the image. See, what has happened is, I think fundamentally what we have to understand is these broader classifications, they have come by the virtue of us inventing newer techniques, refining things over time. Today we have the time to look back at it and categorize and say, this is this is that, this is that. But it all happened in a particular, line.
Hmm.
So there is that involved in that too. So
Yes. Yes. So any sort of thought? Which parts of India did printing start first? I mean, I hear again different narratives. Goa mein like it came first, and then what is again your reading of it? Like
no, I
any.
mean, we've been told, and I think that stands by and large as true. The first ever printing press was set up in Goa, right?
Hmm,
And
hmm,
but there was always, as I said, there was always intentions to it, right?
hmm,
And to sort of like popularize or disseminate certain religious or certain ideologies and things like that. But I think after Goa, a lot of places in India which got picked, and probably they're quite marginalized in history, like Tamil Nadu, like in Chennai, there was a lot of printing press which Varanasi, in fact, was one of the printing hub back in the days, right?
hmm,
And all sorts of, and having these machines was a luxury back in the days, right?
hmm.
If you have one of these machines, it's like you have Google in your hands, like you can do
Yeah,
whatever you want to do.
this is
And of
power.
course access to paper, which was also expensive.
Hmm,
But yeah, so print making as such, of course, like it took a serious blow with a couple of people. Like if you look at the modernists, or if you look at the Bengal school, there was Rabindranath Tagore, there was Nandalal Bose, who were like the pioneers to adapt these things and in their own practice and make copies of it or print. And in fact, Calcutta is still renowned as a printing capital in the country, like the Chitpur, right?
hmm, hmm,
If you
hmm,
go there, you will find all sorts of printing techniques, whatever we will, through the history, through the timeline, whatever we are talking, they are still operational. People are still working with those techniques there. Right? And of course, there is Raja Ravi Verma, who had his own fair share. He sort of like, his one of his friends suggested that why don't you popularize your paintings, using print, and he picked that up idea and he invited a German again to, Lonavala. They set up this press, and then the first chromolithograph was ever printed in the country, right?
yeah.
So, I mean, it's also interesting. Suddenly, a layman, which again is the word you used, could access to a Raja Ravi Verma. I think it was a revelatory thing.
Yeah, yeah. In fact, I interviewed Manu Pillai, and we have documented some bits of Raja Ravi Verma, and
Yeah.
where he spoke about like how his fascination to be more famous and more glorious and sort of the Raja Ravi Verma of India.
But it's
It
just not that. Unfortunately, it has a lot of other connotations to it, which
yeah,
probably
yeah,
sometimes we might not have the time or bandwidth to sit. Like there are a lot of religious or nationalistic approaches or connotations
correct, correct.
around these
Yeah, yeah,
very specific things.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely, there's no sort of one reason for one event to occur. Like it's just that it's the narrative that comes to us, but there are like maybe 1,000 reasons for that one thing to happen. For say Raja Ravi Verma even to move around India, like what was the reason? Yeah, the many layers to it.
True. True.
Cool. Like before concluding, just second last question. If you can give very quick brief landscape, because now with Instagram, I'm just following a lot of printmakers and people who are into like real paper print. Mostly, at least whom I follow, are outside India. So how's sort of the landscape in India and outside India? Because we have such rich art and culture background, but we hardly use paper. We hardly understand that the fifth iteration of a lino cut has got like more refinedness to it as opposed to first, right?
Yeah.
We are not being sensitive to that. Any sort of
See, I mean, I
your
think
observations?
I'm gonna end up in trouble if I start talking about it. So I'm just gonna keep it loose and large in this particular context. It's not that there is still a like holding a technique and not sharing with anyone, or I don't understand that. I think that was the spark of like starting an open space to have these dialogues and allowing access to people who are interested or inclined towards printmaking, right? And in terms of a larger scene or the contemporary printmaking scene, I think there are a lot of things which are happening in the country. Like, for example, there's an organization called Chap Printmaking Studio in Baroda, right? They're a 20-year-old organization, right? Or for the fact, like in Bombay, there is, I mean, I don't know how to even categorize this. There is Pritam Arts, right? Who have a legacy of 30 years of screen printing. They might not be working in the fine art or the artist space for 30 years, but I'm sure they will catch up and they will be there, like and for the matter of fact, if I mean, come on, who doesn't celebrate Diwali in the country, right? All this while we have burned so many crackers, all the paraphernalia around, it's all in Shivkashi, right? It's the printing capital. Any film poster, up until the advent of offset printing, any film poster was printed in Shivkashi, right? So it's also very interesting to look at these practices and where they stem from, how a lot of people find livelihoods. For a lot of people, it's joy exploring a material, or looking at refining a fifth layer or a fifth edition in the lino cut, as you were suggesting, right? So so it's difficult, but there are definitely a lot of people who are invested and who are working towards continuing or keeping these practices alive. That's very much there.
Yeah, there's some ray of hope. Cool. So, what's the future? What, according to you, you have been sort of contemplating and thinking and speculating? I'm sure you must be like undergoing through a lot of churn as well in your mind. But how do you envision future of print in India with now oil, yeah, struggling to survive, paper being challenged with eco-friendly karna hai.
Yeah.
uh,
No, I
uh,
think, in fact, with the consequence of the recent Gapla with Russia and things like that,
yeah,
in fact, we are all struggling. Like, for example, there's this particular paper which is used in packaging T-shirts or shirts. Right? When we buy a brand new shirt, there's a card slipped in a shirt. It's called a
yeah,
duplex board. It's a duplex board is like a recycled board, a material. Earlier, it was like 8 rupees, but I don't think one has to be afraid of it, because there is a tangible aspect to it. It's not just the value of it, but you can still touch it, feel it, romanticize. You can think about it, and there is labor. As long as labor is involved in it, I think it is there to stay. Right?
yeah. Again, sort of survives test of time, and in 2000, I don't know, maybe like 80, someone in metaverse is listening to this and like think, yeah.
Well, I mean, I also hope that I didn't end up in trouble saying. But
Yeah.
it's a contested space. Of course, it's definitely a contest. I
Yeah.
mean, who has the is a question, right? Put them into a framework and say, this is how it works, or this is how. I mean, in the next podcast, you talk to someone else, they might give you a different version of the print history, and them. And I think when before we conclude or anything as such, one thing always reminds me in my mind is I think systems and the need to communicate is the quintessential thing for these kinds or printmaking or printmaking especially, right? And as long as we have that need, I think it'll survive and it'll find its own course. And yeah, we as an organization, Atelier Prati, three of us, we are trying to make to provide that access to people who don't have that access to such infrastructure. And yeah, there are many other people who are doing. And also, as we also make infrastructure for artists, like we make affordable infrastructure for artists. I think in Bangalore there are 25 independent studios who have access to their own etching presses, right? We ourselves have built that. It could be an institute or it could be an artist's individual studio, but people are still willing to use this technique. I think there is hope in that for sure.
Absolutely. I mean, yeah, like all power to this, and it's very very inspiring, and yeah, hope Atelier Prati sort of gives access because the students can then read Odia, and then you can really print books in Odia. A well good design typeface from there. I think I've some dots which now if I connect, I think that's also creating a lot of value to understand how every aspect of print or every aspect of whatever comes to you format, so many layers to it.
True. I mean, in fact, anecdote to it. Lithography in our country still survives because of Urdu. Up until the computer and all these type softwares came into point, there's no still Urdu type, by the way. We got it post 60s when we hit the whole soft type space or a cold type, which is like working with computer and whatever. So lithography is still in parts of Hyderabad. In fact, I think Atelier Prati we got our lithographic presses from a very old printing place in Hyderabad, Chatta Bazaar. And there was a Urdu press which was going to, shut shop, and we sort of went there and, negotiated with them and picked it up from them. Yeah. So yeah, there are these things, it's give and take. Always. As I said, it's the literacy systems which evoke the entire need of all these things. And yeah.
Cool. I think these are endless conversations. I'm just going to come and meet you at Atelier Prati very soon. For this episode, I think we'll conclude for now. It was great talking to you. Thanks for sharing your wonderful insights, and hope the listeners get some more sort of curiosity build as to like kya hai, kya like in this digital world, right? So thanks once again for being on the show.
Thank you, Kedar.
And that's it from today's Gyan session. For show notes and more Gyan, visit audiogyan.com. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to check our other interesting podcast on IVM Network. You can listen to us on IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. To stay tuned, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcast. And if you wish to connect with me, I am at AudioGyan Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.
There's a quick survey to fill out on ivmpodcast.com/survey. It lets us know a little bit more about who's listening to us. And you know what? We're going to do a few prizes. So, we'll do a random drawing of maybe 10 people, and we'll send you all some swag. Remember, that's ivmpodcast.com/survey where you can fill out the survey.
Don't you think that if everyone around you is getting smart, you better be smarter? Hey there, I'm the traveling professor Siddharth Deshmukh, and I'm back with season 2 of my podcast to make you smarter. Smarter with Sid. What's this season's focus about? Well, it's about 10-minute nuggets that will make you stand out at work. It's time to go from smart to smarter. Tune in every Tuesday and Thursday and become smarter with Sid.
Hello! It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri is joined by Shweta Nanda. They talk about the financial independence and how it is to be a woman entrepreneur. On Anish Thing, Anish welcomes ultra-marathon runner Shivani Gharat. Shivani shares her journey of how she ran her first marathon, the mindset of a runner, and what it actually takes to run a full marathon. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Naveen, Akash and Shreyas talk about the Korean band BTS serving in the military and its repercussions. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Wing Greens and their latest acquisitions and about the Indian sexual wellness market. And on Shunya One, Sheila Datya is joined by Dinika Bhatia, CEO and founder of Nuttigrities. They talk about coming from a business family and Dinika's journey in creating healthy and guilt-free snacking. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcast.com. We have some exciting new merch out there for you. Also, do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And do remember to spread the word about these shows and any other shows you might be listening to. Appreciate them, rate them, and review them wherever you are listening to them. You can also check out all our other shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week. Volvo XC40 Recharge, Bumble, Heads Up for Tails, Kotak Privy League Program, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thanks guys, without you this would not be possible.
Do you often find yourself surrounded by conversations about Web3, blockchain, NFTs, DAOs? What are these terms and how do they affect our future on the internet? So many questions, but don't worry, we've got answers to all your questions. Hi, I'm Eklavya Bhattacharya, and on our show Future Proofing, we try to decode the impact of these future technologies on various industries with experts and tech enthusiasts. Tune into new episodes coming out every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app and the website, or wherever you get your podcasts from.